The work of Canadian Women's Foundation and the programs that we support take place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We are grateful for the opportunity to live, to meet, to work, and play on this land. I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, also known as Tiohtià:ke and Montreal. However, we recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough, and we must pursue truth, reconciliation, and decolonization, along with strong allyship in all ongoing efforts to make right with all of our relations. So we have simultaneous interpretation, as I explained. To access it, you click the globe on your toolbar and select your preferred language. If you would like to access Zoom captioning, please enable it on the bottom right of your toolbar. This webinar will be recorded. We will post it on our YouTube for full access. We will not be fielding questions, but we will share the contact information of all the presenters in the chat and in the follow-up email. En français, je vais juste aussi expliquer pour l'interprétation. Vous avez un icône en bas de votre écran. Vous pesez pour choisir l'interprétation en français dans la langue, en effet dans la langue que vous voulez. Et ce webinaire sera enregistré en anglais et nous le publierons sur notre site YouTube pour un accès complet. Alors, si vous voulez utiliser le sous-titrage, normalement, il y a un bouton pour cesser en bas de l'écran dans votre barre d'outils que vous pouvez utiliser. Alors, je pense avec ça, vous avez toutes les informations nécessaires pour débuter notre événement. Je suis très heureuse d'être avec vous ce matin et je vais inviter Diana de Oxfam Canada de venir, et je pense qu'elle est là, de venir parler avec nous et vous présenter les excellentes expertes qui vont parler ce matin. Bonjour, Diana.
Thank you, Anu, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here, and it's really great to see how many are joining us this morning. As I mentioned, we have a fantastic lineup, and so I'm gonna pass it over to our first speaker. Shalini Konanur is from the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, but also Color of Poverty, Color of Change. Shalini, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Canadian Women's Foundation and Oxfam for organizing this. So I want to speak today primarily about the impact of the budget on racialized women. In moving through the pandemic, racialized women and their families, we know, have faced higher unemployment rates and a continuation and likely a worsening of the disproportionate levels of poverty across Canada. To be frank, very little in this most recent budget will impact those existing realities. For me, at its core, yesterday's budget fails to address the fundamental systems change that needs to take place in Canada to start dismantling the impact of systemic racism. Commitments around anti-racism in yesterday's budget were small and, in my view, weak. And they simply do not follow through on the promises made by the government in the last 2 years to actually resource anti-racism actions effectively. I want to talk about 3 areas. The first is a call that Color of Poverty has been making for the past 15 years around employment equity. And we do want to welcome the announcement of approximately $1.9 million to complete the Federal Employment Equity Act review. But the truth is, it's just not enough. The race-gender wage gap, the inequity to access in employment insurance, and the continued discrimination in the workforce work together to simply create poorer labor market outcomes for racialized women. They get paid less, they get hired to work in precarious work situations, and they make up a large population of low-wage workers. We need budgeted action to strengthen the employment equity scheme, including enforcement. The truth is, you cannot assert a right to employment equity when the scheme is not enforced. What is the point? We wanted to see in the budget clear and targeted resources for the scheme to be enforced. On racism, the budget did address anti-hate, but the reality is Canada continues to fail on its promises and its platitudes around anti-racism. We have seen over the past many years and through COVID, the impacts of systemic racism on the health, education outcomes, income outcomes, housing outcomes, and access to justice outcomes for Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities, and in particular, racialized women. What Color of Poverty and SALCO is seeking is anti-racism legislation that will embed the critical work that needs to be done, and a fully resourced anti-racism secretariat with a budget to start a national action plan against racism. This is a promise that Canada made 20 plus years ago. We have gone through 20 plus years of budget cycles without addressing this promise. We are also calling for the adding of employment equity consistent obligations and conditions to all economic recovery, social and physical infrastructure investment, and financial transfers. And I suspect you'll hear from a lot of us today that GVA plus analysis lacks any sort of reality in terms of this budget. That plus is something that we speak about a lot. I cannot, when I look at this budget, figure out how that plus was implemented. In immigration, the budget has provided a lot of funding to IRCC, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, to deal with the backlog and, to be frank, the deplorable conditions and state of processing of immigration wait times. What that means for racialized families is that many have now been waiting years to reunify with family, to get immigration protections for leaving an abusive partner, and waiting to be able to work here legally and pushed into illegal work. But the truth is, the budgeting to enhance immigration processing actually makes no difference to a structurally racist immigration system that is designed to keep racialized communities vulnerable to exploitation in Canada. For far too long, we have benefited from the labor of migrant workers. We have benefited from pushing people to become undocumented and work illegally. We have benefited from not recognizing and providing immigration security for the incredible contributions of these populations, not just to our economy, but to our communities. From my view, a cost benefit and GVA plus analysis requires the creation of an appropriate and fastest cost-effective measure to address the immigration crisis. And that reality is creating a program that regularizes the status of those Canadians who are here with no status or precarious immigration status. That is the fastest, most cost-effective, most equitable way to address this issue. It would impact the immigration backlog. It would allow people in this country to access work and supports, and it would signal Canada's true commitment to dismantling racism within our immigration system. I want to end by saying this. You know, I recognize that there are some announcements in this budget that may find their way to some small support for the racialized communities that I work with. But the reality is that they do not address the ever-growing impact of systemic racism. For all of the government's platitudes on recognizing that COVID laid bare those inequities for racialized communities, the government's budget decisions show that it has moved away from the commitment to improving the lives of these communities in any targeted or meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalini. What a great start, everybody. Really, really, really disappointing to hear. Next, we're going to move to Tamsin Fitzgerald. She is with the Women of the Métis Nation. Tamsin, looking forward to hearing from you.
Hello, everyone. I am a big fan of brevity, so I will keep my comments short and sweet. As we all know, this is a considerably less meaty budget than we've seen in previous years. I think I read something like 500 pages fewer, and it shows. There's also no visible distinctions-based approach that's really taken beyond the $190 million investment over 7 years for housing in Métis communities. Throughout the budget, actually, Métis is mentioned 3 times. So the distinctions-based approach is lacking quite a bit throughout the document. As is often the case, there's a pan-Indigenous approach that's taken with much more of a focus on First Nations issues, boil water issues on reserves and housing infrastructure on reserves, which is absolutely important. But it would be nice to see kind of more of a balanced distinctions-based approach taken with equal attention paid to Inuit and Métis populations and women and gender diverse folks. So that is definitely lacking throughout this document. Indigenous women are only mentioned in terms of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis that is happening, which absolutely needs attention, which absolutely needs funding and investments and resources. But Indigenous women are so much more than the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis. Indigenous women are contributing to society. They're entrepreneurs. They're pursuing their education, and I don't see any of that reflected in this budget here, and so that's quite disappointing. I will note that the investments in the legacies of the residential school system are notable, which is good. There seems to be an equal focus on healing as well as commemoration, which are both important aspects to hold together. So that is good. I was quite surprised to see that there was no mention of Joyce's principal at all throughout the document. Joyce Echaquan, whose death was caused at the hands of racist healthcare professionals in Quebec. No mention of Joyce's principal throughout the document and ensuring safer environments for Indigenous women that are accessing healthcare settings and healthcare services. So that is quite disappointing. We're still kind of internalizing the budget here at Les Femmes de Pemswak, so we will be coming out with more official thoughts in the coming days, so please do stay tuned. But those are my initial thoughts just right off the top. No distinctions-based approach. Indigenous women are really only part of the MMIWG part of the budget, and it's quite lackluster, quite a lackluster budget this time of year, and we're a little disappointed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamsin. All really, really excellent points. Yeah, I'm starting to recognize a trend here from one speaker to the other. Next, we're going to hear from Emily Coyle. She's with the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. Emily, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Diana. As you probably know, the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies is a member-driven organization. And so we have 24 members that are located across the country. And we work, and the people in our network and our collaborators and our partners work with people who are often oppressed by multiple overlapping systems. And so looking at this budget, which is often siloed, we are looking at it with a global perspective. And we want to make sure that the people that we work with, who often fall through all of the holes of the various safety nets that have been created, are addressed in whatever budgets are coming out. And so we work along the spectrum of interventions. Often, when I'm looking at budgets, I want to make sure that I'm looking at what is being presented in terms of upstream supports, what is being presented in terms of supports to people in the midstream or people who are, actively going through the legal system. And then we look at some of the supports that are post-incarceration as well, which are supports that mirror the upstream supports as well. But certainly with the added stigma of criminalization and a criminal record attached to it, which make it even more difficult for people to access services and supports. And so I want to make sure that we're looking at all of the social determinants of health, like housing, health, dental care, mental health supports, employment opportunities, childcare, nutritious food, a basic income. And when looking at all of those, yes, as you said, Diana, earlier today, it is the budget of small victories. I'm probably quoting you wrong, but there are very, small nuggets included in this budget that we can say, okay, we can point to that and say that's great. And prior to the release of this budget, one of our key partners, the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, submitted a budget submission that was signed onto by 26 organizations, many of whom are here today. And we were making a simple ask. We need core funding for our organizations because our work is consistently frustrated by providing programming funding year over year that requires organizations like ours and others to spend our precious time writing funding proposals that don't bring sustained and stable funding to our work. Certainly that's not something that we saw in this budget, unfortunately. And another thing that we are concerned with, of course, is that a lot of the people we work with, while housing dollars are important, many of the people we work with are tenants, and tenant support was not mentioned specifically. Right now, rents are sky high across the country. One story that illustrates how out of control this issue is right now is that one of our locals supporting a woman who was looking to make bail was asked to bring a tent to the bail hearing. This was the only housing that she could access, and for her, it was better than being put into prison on remand. And so that people are choosing between remand in prison and a tent should really be an embarrassment for this government. And I did not see any tenant support mentioned. Of course, I already said this, housing money is always welcome, but we want to ensure that funding is available to everyone. And for our network, who work with criminalized women specifically, it's been hard to get some of that funding, especially rural, remote, and northern communities who have been underfunded in the program so far. And so we want to, although there's money there, we want to make sure it gets into the right hands. I looked at the money for Indigenous climate initiatives and specific mention in there of the inclusion of women and gender diverse people. Great, that's wonderful. But I think we have to remember that it has to go hand in hand with a commitment to not use punitive measures for those women and gender diverse people who are the land and water defenders who are being criminalized for doing just that right now. I'm sure that others on this call will address the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence. And I wanted to add what I hope is a helpful reminder that in our work, this concept of victim and perpetrator of violence are not clear lines. And so overwhelmingly, the work that we do with people who have been harmed themselves and then are continuing to experience state-sanctioned harm while jails and prisons are left out of those conversations. And so I want to make sure that, and our voice was present in the preparation of the National Action Plan. So I always want to remind people about that. We work a lot with Two-Spirit, trans, and non-binary folks. And I don't want to say very much about that, but other than to put a plug today for another talk that is being done on the 2022 federal budget by the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity and the Executive Director of Wisdom to Action at noon today for a queer analysis of the federal budget. So just a plug in for them. And then lastly, there's a few smaller pieces that were hidden in that federal budget that may not be of particular interest to others, but were very interesting to us. Recently this year, I guess it was last year, there was a decision of the Nova Scotia courts around a particularly egregious form of solitary confinement called dry celling, where people are put into a cell that doesn't have running water and 24-hour lights on in order to expel suspected contraband from their bodies. And in the case that went to court in Nova Scotia, a woman was suspected of having contraband in her vagina. And she won her case because it was impossible to determine how long it would take for someone to expel anything out of the vagina. And interestingly, they hid a little line in there that there will be an amendment to the CCRA to take out dry celling as a practice for people who are suspected of having contraband in their vaginas, which is not entirely the win that we want and doesn't necessarily relate so much to the budget, but was interesting that it was put in there. There is money in there around COVID-19 responses in the prisons, which I think is great. I'd like to see that money go toward preventing further lockdowns, which were very torturous for people throughout COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, there is some money there for increased supports to legal aid. And they did mention specifically that that money would be geared towards helping people who are Indigenous, Black, and other people who don't often get access to justice supports. And so I'll just leave it there. I think I may have gone over time. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. I mean, it's really amazing how we've just had 3 speakers who could have really strengthened that plus in GBA plus had there been more communication with some of these folks. So next we're going to hear from Katherine Scott from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Go ahead, Katherine.
Thanks, Diana. And I completely agree. Those were really thought-provoking responses. And thanks to the organizers. So pleased to be participating this morning and pulling this really terrific panel together on such short notice. I wanted to spend my few minutes sharing some thoughts about the larger public policy conversation that's been going on, certainly in advance of the budget, about the role of the federal government, actually, or any government, any level for that matter, as we attempt to move beyond the pandemic, admittedly, actually, with no success so far. I mean, we've seen for several months now the steady beat on Bay Street to scale back government spending, to reassert fiscal rectitude, to reimpose austerity. The suggestion being that the federal government's lost the economic plot, that the Liberal NDP Accord will consign future generations to penury. You know, we had large articles last week talking about the role of the financial sector, their good charitable tax donors, the like. The finance minister herself in our conversation on International Women's Day was pretty explicit in her efforts to scale back expectations about with respect to this particular budget. And, you know, as Shalini and Emily and Tamsin's already have suggested, you know, she's delivered on that. This was certainly a thinner budget, certainly in terms of heft, but also thinner in terms of content. And it really was, I think, a fairly significant shift where we've seen a larger reduction in spending than had been expected. And this actually in the context where we've actually seen rising revenues related to stronger economic growth in the last quarter and certainly higher energy prices. In total, the budget allocates only $31 billion in new spending over 5 years, and that's a fraction of what the total certainly was last year. And even Kevin Page in the Globe commented that, quote, "It's not a big spending budget." And this certainly compared to the size of our economy or our current fiscal capacity, or as we've been talking about, in comparison to the scale of the need. So these modest investments that were announced yesterday will ensure that federal spending falls as a percentage of GDP to 14.7% back by 2026-27, which was the level recorded in 2019, back before the pandemic. And to assist with this task, the government also announced it's queuing up a comprehensive strategic policy review with the aim of identifying additional savings of $6 billion over the next 5 years and $3 billion thereafter. I saw that tucked away in the back of the budget program review, and I know for those of us, certainly as old as I am, remember the days back in the 90s, it's certainly to strike fear, and what that could mean, we'll have to see. But anyway, so spending review is on the horizon. So as people have noted, certainly that the government did deliver on some of the selected commitments in the Liberal NDP Accord, that's certainly around dental care, although details clearly are to come. But it was silent on pharmacare and long-term care, which were both key items on the agenda. Certainly, that was certainly of concern to us. There was $2 billion in healthcare dollars for the surgery backlog, and some money certainly directed to mental health initiatives. There was $10 billion set aside for housing, and I know we're hearing about housing a bit later. And you know, Morna's going to be talking about the $625 million that was set aside for childcare infrastructure, all to the good. Critically important funds that are going to be needed if we're going to have any chance of achieving a universal program. The government also committed $273 million to developing and delivering an employment strategy for people with disabilities via the Opportunities Fund. We've got, and I know Lise will be speaking about the new allocation of money, $529 million for the provinces and territories to deliver GBB programming. Presumably, this is the carrot that will entice the engagement of the provinces and territories, hopefully in the launch sometime this century of the National Action Plan. So these programs, I think they're important investments, as people have noted, and they do advance many key feminist objectives. But our position at the CCPA was the budget certainly could have gone further. And it certainly could have gone further as it affects low-income communities, because there's effectively no immediate respite in sight for those experiencing the greatest increase in costs of living that's going on right now. Certainly on the really key issue we were looking for, low-income communities are still waiting for the promised EI reforms and the new Canada Disability Benefit. There was some money tied to training or expanding access to EI dollars for training. But, the major changes that we're waiting for, like coverage for self-employed, higher benefit levels, setting a minimum income floor, ensuring or securing the federal role in the financing of the program, they certainly weren't there. So we could have gone further. And we could have gone further with revenue measures. Like there's a new one-time 15% surtax on banks and life insurance companies on taxable incomes over $1 billion. And they're imposing a new permanent 1.5% increase on those same companies. But why do those measures only apply to the banks? The other 80% of the companies that cleared $1 billion in profit last year in oil and gas or tech or grocery stores, they won't see any of that. They won't see any excess profit tax. And the government certainly could have delivered on their commitment to introduce a minimum 15% tax on the top 1% of earners. But that's still under study. So, federal budgets are typically 1/10 economics and 9/10 theater. And I think the goal of this budget was clearly to telegraph fiscal rectitude and to ratchet back expectations after the heady pandemic years. Don't get used to this. Don't get used to programs that cut child poverty rates by 10%. So what I worry about is what this means for delivering a truly universal childcare system, or implementing a plan that will keep Indigenous women and girls safe, or lifting people with disabilities out of poverty. Because I think we're foolish to ignore the power of institutional inertia and really, I would say, the mobilization of financial elites to contain and constrain government ambition and vision. So the question was whether this is a feminist budget. So I'd say no to that question. Last year, gender was mentioned over 750 times in the budget. This year it was mentioned 18. Talked to Tamsin mentioned the word Métis only appearing 4 times. So I don't think equality and inclusion were the animating themes of the budget. It's more of a pivot budget. It's a missed opportunity, but I think it's an invitation for us. We have to dig deeper and push harder. So I'll leave it there, and thanks again. And I should call out to my colleagues. We put up an analysis I can share in the chat of the budget that we released yesterday. So.
Great, thank you, Katherine, and for giving us a very clear answer of how feminist this budget is. Next, we're going to hear from Martha Jackman with the National Association of Women and the Law. Go ahead, Martha.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to the organizers, and I really appreciate the presentation. We really appreciate the presentations of our fellow presenters as well. So just a quick reminder that Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees women, especially women facing intersecting racism, poverty, and other barriers to equality, equal protection and benefit of the law. And that constitutional imperative applies to economic and fiscal policy and spending, as well as social policy. And in particular, it applies to the Budget Act. So the requirement to ensure that the budget offers equal protection and benefit to women is a constitutional requirement, not simply a policy choice that can be picked up one year and dropped the next. So we certainly welcome and applaud the commitments in the 2022 budget to all measures that reinforce women's equality, including the new and existing systemic equality action plans that have been proposed in the budget around racism, LGBTQ2 action plans, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Safe Sport, and others. And in particular, we're certainly glad to see, and we will watch carefully, the government's commitment to ensure diversity in the new Superior Court positions that have been created, and obviously the Supreme Court of Canada appointment from Ontario that we are waiting for. But we're very disappointed by the loss of the gender focus of the 2021 budget. It's largely faded, and other presenters have underlined things that are missing from the budget. We would echo, very disappointing that there isn't a funding commitment to long-term care. The vast majority of workers and residents in long-term care are women, and this omission has a huge impact on women in Canada. We're disappointed that there is a small reference to employment insurance reform, more study and consultation, for example, around including self-employed workers, nothing around a strategy, much less funding for a guaranteed livable basic income program. And in this case, we would urge the government to take a look at Senator Kim Pate's bill S-233, calling for a federal strategy around guaranteed livable basic income. The budget also refers to the need to continue the shift in military culture. But again, we're expecting within weeks, former Supreme Court Justice Louise Arbour's report, which followed on Justice Deschamps' report on sexual assault, harassment, and discrimination in the military. There is a commitment around modernizing the military justice system, but there is no funding commitment attached to that. And we've already heard about the current civil justice system's inability to absorb the vast number of cases that are simply being transferred from the military to the civil justice system. And so we need commitments, we need accountability, and we need funding around that. Again, a lack of commitment to funding around firearms control. There is a commitment to a modest increase in substance use and addiction program funding, but we would have expected some kind of signal around the decriminalization of drug possession, which would be the most human rights compliant as well as fiscally responsible way of addressing the current crisis of drug poisoning and death. There's a commitment to increase criminal legal aid funding, as well as funding for legal aid around immigration and refugee services, but again, a long-standing deficit in civil legal aid funding, which is the legal aid funding that women primarily rely on, nowhere to be found in the budget. Emily mentioned the lack of commitment to core funding for women's and other organizations to hold governments to account. But what I'd really like to finish on is the point that Katherine and the CCPA have made. In the mid-90s, in the midst of a Social Security review where women were actually being actively consulted, the former Chrétien Martin government brought in a series of major program and funding cuts that resulted in downloading and the dismantling social programs that we are still living with today in areas of housing, violence, and poverty. So when the budget talks about a policy review or tax reform discussions or consultations, we absolutely need to be assured of the federal government's recognition of its constitutional obligation to engage in any kind of fiscal or tax policy planning, spending program cuts in a way that is fully compliant with women's equality rights guarantees in the Charter. Otherwise, we're going to end up with the situation that we did in the 90s, and that is something that no one in Canada wants to live through again. Et j'aimerais ajouter évidemment que l'ANFT serait heureux d'entretenir vos questions en suivi en français, and of course we would welcome any follow-up media questions in English. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Martha. A lot of interesting points. Next, we're going to hear from Amar and Nijhawan, my colleague at Oxfam Canada.
Thank you, Deanna, and thank you everybody for the amazing analysis so far. I'm learning so much and taking avid notes. I'll keep my statements short and sweet. It's been reflected a lot in what's been saying, but I guess I'm feeling pretty lukewarm about this budget. I think there were important investments that advance feminist goals, like Katherine mentioned, but the budget could have gone a lot further. And from the perspective of Oxfam, looking at issues of decent work for women in Canada and also how we're supporting the care economy. So I'd like to start off that I found it was really interesting that, Minister Freeland really highlighted that investing in a childcare system, as we know, is good feminist economic policy and has important impacts on the way that women across Canada can access crucial care supports and better jobs. But calling it women's liberation immediately after, I found was a little bit of a stretch, especially when measures to support care workers and racialized women workers across the countries who are often concentrated in low-income, precarious jobs were pretty minimal. So echoing some of the concerns of the other panelists, I saw there was a lot of rhetoric that we've been hearing throughout the year, but not as much action as we'd want to see. Some things that were really helpful, pointing to workers' rights and childcare. There was more money to support new job training opportunities. The real focus was on mid-career workers and transitioning into in-demand jobs. There was also the introduction of a $15 federal minimum wage and legislating more sick days. But it was interesting how last year's budget, the government explicitly stated that, we acknowledge the disproportionate impact of COVID on women in the economy, and they expressed a commitment towards an inclusive, sustainable, resilient economy that values women's work. We saw that through a lot of programs that came funded through the ESDC last year, focusing on women's employment readiness specifically, but how that's been monitored, the accountability or the investments that carry over, we can't really see. What's been interestingly stated by a few panelists is that, gender was pretty absent from the budget itself. We saw the gender diversity statement as completely separate from the actual the actual budget itself. But what the gender diversity statement tells us is that where the most women have been employed in 2021 is in the care economy. It's in nursing, it's in health services support. The gender diversity statement also tells us that, immigrant and visible minority women continue to be less likely to participate in the labor market as well, and Indigenous folks and people with disability are less likely to participate in the labor force. So I guess while I was happy that, there was more funding announced around a care infrastructure fund to really build out nonprofit housing and care, speaking to our universal system. But the real crisis in the care economy that we're seeing around wages, poor working conditions, burnout, labor shortages, recruitment were not referenced in this budget document at all. And how are we expected to build so many new childcare spaces? I think in Ontario, it's 85,000, but across the country, it's a lot more when there's no workforce strategy to address the early childhood educators. And you can extend that to every part of the care economy in this budget itself. I think I read somewhere yesterday that of all the mentions of health that were made in the budget, nothing was talking about the workers itself. So I think we really need to interrogate, what financial or what budgetary policies are actually going to continue to exist after we hear a lot of rhetoric. Where's the action? One thing that I found interesting was that there was a measure to sort of support foreign credential recognition in the health sector to help skilled immigrants secure meaningful, well-paying jobs in healthcare. It's useful, but that's something that's been asked for a really, really long time. So going back to what was referenced earlier. Deanna, I think you called it the budget of low-hanging fruit. I think that's kind of it. Like Shalini mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of talk but little action on anti-racism and really reforming Canada's immigration system broadly. Most of the money that went under the sort of temporary foreign worker section of the budget was really targeted to the employers and the regulatory forces behind the industries that a lot of temporary foreign workers work in this country, but not improving working conditions or the fundamental issues. The Migrant Justice Network put out this report in 2020 saying that there's 25,000 migrant care workers in Canada, almost all of whom lived in their employers' homes, and most of whom had an extremely difficult time accessing CERB, income supports, a lot of the sort of social protections that were given at the beginning of the pandemic. And really that, discrepancy in the workforce and that precarity wasn't addressed in this budget. So I think I'm going to end here by saying it really was a missed opportunity, and I think we can dig deeper and go further. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you, Amar, and yeah, really great to spotlight the workers who are making everything possible in this country. Yes, it takes efforts and resources on all fronts to grow a national childcare system. So next, we're going to hear from Lise Martin from the Women's Shelters Canada.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to my colleagues who have shared their thoughts on the budget, and to everyone who has joined us this morning to listen to our thoughts. I'm going to speak specifically in terms of the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence. In the budget, they have allocated $539 million over 5 years. So we were happy to see it reflected, to see the NAP reflected in the budget. But want to note that much of the dollars are backloaded in years 3, 4, and 5. Also, want to mention for example, in next year, 2023-24, there is $78 million allocated to the National Action Plan. And given that this is being distributed on a per capita basis, that basically means approximately $5 million for the 6 smaller provinces and less than $1 million for the territories, which is literally a drop in the bucket. And so distributing simply on a per capita basis, as is the go-to formula for so many things in Canada, makes it virtually impossible to ensure that the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence will be intersectional. And also that it will take into account, where violence is more predominant, the rural-urban divide, all of these things. It makes it very, very challenging. And our concerns go beyond the dollars allocated in terms of the National Action Plan. When we first started advocating for a National Action Plan over 10 years ago, one of our driving sentence, if you want, was that the levels of services and protections provided to women should not depend on their postal code. And so, because of the way that the National Action Plan is being set up, it leads us to believe that this is not the way that things are going. In 2014, when we initially developed the blueprint for Canada's National Action Plan, we asked that there be consistency across and within jurisdictions in policies and legislations that address gender-based violence. We asked that there be consistent approaches to prevention and responses to gender-based violence. Our current understanding is that there's individual agreements are being drawn up between the federal government and individual provinces and territories. So for me, that really begs the question, how is this a national action plan? How is it going to bring back consistency? How is it going to ensure that the levels of services and protection provided to you don't depend on your postal code? And our second concern with the National Action Plan and how it's unfolding is how will civil society organizations be meaningfully involved in the process, and what accountability frameworks are being put in place? So as Katherine said, we will be pushing harder, and there's a lot of hard pushing that needs to come. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lise. Yes, let's push for a holistic approach to this. Next, we're going to hear from Caitlin Schwan. She is with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Diana, and certainly to the Canadian Women's Foundation and Oxfam for hosting this excellent event. I'll keep my comments very brief. I want to focus on housing in the budget. So the commitment of the $10 billion to housing indicates an understanding of the severity of the crisis that we're in. But what the budget doesn't reflect is the very gendered nature of the housing crisis. What we know is that low-income women-led households are experiencing the greatest need in Canada. 28% of women-led single-parent households are actually in core housing need, and that's double the rate for men. And we know that these numbers are much higher for Indigenous, Black, and racialized women and gender diverse folks, as well as women with disabilities. So the question for us is, will the budget meaningfully improve housing for these women and gender diverse folks, the folks who are struggling the most? And I think there is serious reason to be concerned that it won't. What we saw in the budget is a major focus on increasing housing supply quite broadly, largely within the private market, with the idea that this will increase affordable housing for everyone. But what we know is that supply alone does not produce affordable housing. And supply is not going to end the housing crisis unless it's tied to the demand for deeply affordable housing. And that demand is very gendered and intersectionally gendered. Specifically, I'm really quite concerned that the budget reflects a trickle-down economics approach to housing, an economic model that's really failed women the world over. So, for example, if we increase the supply of middle-class housing in financialized housing markets through programs like the Housing Accelerator Fund, it is really unlikely that women in greatest need are going to be able to access that housing, and it's not necessarily going to have a downward pressure on rents unless we're also massively regulating financial actors. So while there is also, I mean, certainly we did see some commitments to affordable housing in the budget. What really matters for women and gender diverse folks is how we end up defining what affordable means. The definition of affordable housing really needs to be income-based and not market-based. If you are a single mom on social assistance, your capacity to pay your rent is not tied to the average rent of your neighbors, it's tied to your income. So unless we're tying affordability criteria to income, our housing programs are going to continue to fail low-income women and their diversity. Lastly, I'll just say what would make a difference for low-income women and gender diverse folks across the country would be the creation of deeply targeted affordable housing and non-market housing and commitments to women-focused housing. Unfortunately, only one housing program has announced gender-specific commitment. That's the Rapid Housing Initiative. So in the coming months, certainly the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network will really be seeking specific commitments and carve-outs for women and gender diverse folks as these programs get operationalized. And I would just end on kind of emphasizing Martha's point that and reminding the government there is a constitutional obligation for the budget to provide equal benefit to women, and this includes the area of housing. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. Just for everyone to be aware, we have 4 more speakers at our event this morning. And so next we're going to hear from Sahar Raza from the National Right to Housing Network.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you everyone for the really sharp gendered analyses today. I just want to echo Caitlin's little talk about housing and echo that we're certainly happy to see the federal government invest in housing after decades of largely recusing itself from that responsibility at the expense of our social and affordable housing stock, which has really dwindled since the 80s and 90s, and at the expense of women and other marginalized folks who disproportionately face housing need. And so in particular, very happy to see investments in co-ops and in the Rapid Housing Initiative, both of which are key sources of adequate and affordable housing for women and marginalized folks. But there could have been a much bigger focus on non-market housing, on Indigenous housing, on deeply affordable housing, and on regulating private market actors. And I think this speaks to the issue that Caitlin raised, which is that women, racialized folks, low-income households, rural remote communities, and other folks in greatest housing need are just not being meaningfully targeted or prioritized by our housing investments. And this is actually a violation of Canada's legislated right to housing obligations, which legally require the government to target and prioritize the most vulnerable in any budgetary or policy decision about housing. And yet there is not a single mention of housing as a fundamental human right in the budget, which signals to me that our government is not taking these legal human rights obligations seriously. And this is concerning because there's nothing complicated about the right to housing. I mean, at its core, it's about centering people's basic need for safe, adequate, and affordable housing so that no one ends up desperate or homeless. And it's about prioritizing basic human dignity and putting people before profit in this housing sector. And that really shouldn't be too much to ask in one of the world's wealthiest countries, which we have seen respond urgently when it comes to other issues like COVID-19 and even these latest investments in defense. And so just for an example, we have seen troubling underinvestments in urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing, despite the fact that the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry told us that a lack of safe and affordable housing increases the risks of violence and harm for Indigenous women. So not only are we failing on our right to housing here, but we're also failing on the rights of Indigenous peoples, the rights of women, and our supposed focus on reconciliation in this budget. And we also saw the affordability criteria in yesterday's housing program largely remain out of reach for folks in core housing need. And we are continuing to delay in regulating private investors and large corporate landlords in the housing market. And it's known that the foreign investor ban will not have a significant impact, which means that we are still allowing these wealthy investors to hoard and extract wealth from housing at the continued expense of women, racialized folks, other marginalized folks, all of whom we expect to see fall into deeper housing need. And just to end this point, by the way, addressing these gaps wouldn't cost anything other than political will. And so it's particularly frustrating. So I could dig in deeper, but just want to leave us with the point today that these rights-based gaps in the budget need to be meaningfully addressed in the months to come if Canada is to truly address this housing crisis and honor its legal commitments to housing as a fundamental human right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar. Yes, the absence of a rights-based approach in the budget came through for many of us, and I think for Frederic Chabot from Action Canada for Sexual Health as well. So please go ahead, Fred.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers in the panel. This is just deeply, deeply interesting. In recent years, Canada has made historic commitments to sexual and reproductive health and rights, SRHR, including the first ever $45 million for a domestic sexual and reproductive health fund in the 2021 budget, and the 2019 commitment to direct $700 million per year to the neglected areas of SRHR by 2023. This funding matters because investing in gender equality and creating the conditions for people's human rights to be upheld is long-term work and needs to be prioritized every year. That's the context in which we looked at the 2022 budget, as we understand that each of them builds on the preceding ones. It must be said, though, and other panelists have brought attention to that it is concerning that there's a near total absence of anything directly relating to SRHR in this one. For comparison, the word sexual appeared 105 times in budget 21 and only 5 times in budget 2022. Canada, and especially a feminist government, must continue to name and support the realization of every person's sexual and reproductive health and rights. Still, there were some good developments in Budget 22, and we celebrate them in our longer form analysis that we'll publish later today. For this conversation, though, I'd like to focus on one important point. The budget specifically mentions Putin and the invasion of Ukraine as threats to our safety, which prompted immediate investment in armed forces. It speaks to the need to equip Canada for a world that has become more dangerous and need fiscal and physical firepower, that's a quote. And to further quote the document, tanks rolling across Ukraine didn't change the goal of the budget, but has reinforced our deepest conviction, democracy. It is of utmost importance to understand that the fight against sexual and reproductive rights cannot be separated from the larger anti-rights and anti-democratic efforts. For example, in Poland, the ultra-nationalist government is seeking to criminalize all forms of abortion and support municipalities declaring for LGBT-free zones. Hungary just re-elected Viktor Orban, who used fear-mongering around sexuality education and threatened abortion rights under the guise of promoting traditional family values to win. Russia leads the pack at the Human Rights Council and other global spaces on the weaponizing of family values to undermine SRHR and gender equality. The US is about to see the reversal of Roe v. Wade as voting rights are under severe attacks to permit the passing of those unpopular policies. Political scientists have long noted that women's civil rights and democracy go hand in hand because women's political participation is more likely to lead to more egalitarian democracy and counters autocrats and right-wing nationalist leaders' instrumental use of hierarchical gender relations to shore up nationalist autocratic rule. Hostility to SRHR binds many political agendas where women's rights, abortion, and LGBTQ+ rights are presented as threats to a natural order and to the nation. We do not believe that strengthening democracy is about increased military spending. Strengthening democracy should be about the strongest possible commitments to a robust and vibrant civil society, to feminist movements, and to increasing gender equality, particularly through the protection of SRHR at home and abroad. This should be reflected in every single budget, especially one where the goal is to strengthen democracy, and we did not see that. Thank you, Diana.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fred. Really nailing it on the head there. Next, we're going to hear from Anjum Sultana from Plan International Canada.
Thank you so much for this great event. I'm the Director of Youth Leadership and Policy Advocacy at Plan International Canada, which is a part of a global organization that strives for a just world by advancing children's rights and equality for girls and young women around the world. With respect to Budget 2022, we were encouraged to see promising commitments to fight the COVID-19 pandemic globally and strengthen global health systems. We know to end the pandemic here, we need to end the pandemic everywhere. And the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the safety and well-being of people in Canada is inextricably linked with people around the world, including the most vulnerable and marginalized. We also appreciated the commitment towards ensuring greater flexibility for charities to do their work by amending the Income Tax Act, reflecting the spirit of Bill S-216, which is currently being considered in Parliament. This would enable organizations, specifically charities, to provide resources to organizations that are not qualified donees. This will be critical to allowing true partnership with organizations such as women-led and youth-led organizations here in Canada and around the world, and would allow us to move the localization agenda forward. Finally, we were encouraged to see that in a time of multiple intersecting crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, protracted conflicts, and the pressing climate emergency, there was an increase to official development assistance by Canada. This is all a step in the right direction. However, more needs to be done to meet the challenges of this moment, and Canada needs to demonstrate feminist global leadership. Around the world, COVID-19 is unraveling decades of progress on gender equality and the rights of women and girls in all their diversity. The pandemic has increased existing vulnerabilities and is pushing millions of women and girls into poverty and eroding their rights. That's why Canada's feminist international assistance policy must not only be upheld, but strengthened and adequately funded. A feminist approach is both life-changing and life-saving by advancing the fundamental rights of girls and young health and protection from violence. Our youngest generations are bearing the brunt of the knock-on effects of the pandemic and are on the front lines of protracted conflicts and the climate emergency. The statistics are staggering. Today, 1 in 6 children live in a conflict-affected area. 11 million girls will never go back to school because of the pandemic. Approximately 1 billion children, nearly half of the world's 2.2 billion children, live in countries classified as extremely high risk to climate impacts. As we can see, the ramifications of this time will not be felt equally around the world. Now is our moment to raise our ambitions and invest in our health and well-being, especially for our youngest generations. Our collective future depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjum, for really drawing light on the global aspect of the budget as well. Last but in no way least, we will be hearing from Bonnie Brayton from Dawn Canada. Bonnie, we look forward to hearing from you.
I was supposed to unmute and take my picture, but I was busy looking at what I was going to say.
Yes, and please put on your video. There we go, perfect.
Right, and thank you. And I want to thank all the speakers before me, and of course for the chance to actually have the last word. Is quite a daunting task, but I think in this case, because everybody's done such a good job, I'm grateful. So obviously we're very disappointed that there's nothing about the national disability benefit in this budget. I will say with some skepticism that this better be an indicator that we are just getting started, and that with this Liberal NDP coalition, we're supposed to see some promise to all people living in Canada. And I actually want to make a note of something, because we're not making a strong commitment to marginalized people in this budget, and it's reflected even in the language, because it references Canadians and not people living in Canada over and over again. All of the other speakers have mentioned this is not an intersectional budget. It's not even a GBA plus budget, and I have to agree. It's a very siloed budget. Women with disabilities, as my colleagues on this call know, represent fully 24% of women in this country, and this government's known that since 2019. The rate of disability of Indigenous and Black women is above 30%. The majority of human rights are disability related, but where is that in any of this budget? I don't see it. Happy to see there'll be disaggregated data increases, but when will it be fully reflected instead of, I have to be frank, politically cherry picked, and that happens over and over again at the cost of the most marginalized. And this is another one of those budgets where you kind of see that, you know, a little bit of this and that, and really no focus that's going to make an impact. The employment strategy for people with disabilities was mentioned, but where's the money for social development? What do I mean? Well, we need to build the capacity of civil society. In the case of this government, have they forgotten that it was all of us, women, people with disabilities, paid and unpaid caregivers, who got us through the pandemic alongside you? Are you moving on now? It's like, okay, so next steps with or without us, this is a big question for me. Again, I think this is a very siloed budget, and I will say the word everyone knows, which is that women with disabilities have been footnoted once again. And this is something Dawn Canada has been pushing back on, and using that kind of language to understand you cannot footnote the largest, most underserved women in this country. Going to the dental care thing again, this is a great initiative, but I want to raise some questions. Well, it's wonderful, but guess what? How many accessible dental clinics do you think there are in Canada? And how many people with disabilities are working in the dentistry sector? People with disabilities are suddenly going to be just, you know, supposed to be grateful. And again, I want to make that point. Disability rights continue to be an afterthought, but we're supposed to be grateful when we're mentioned in a budget. And like I said, these issues around human rights keep getting pushed off this way, and disability is over here in this other place where it just doesn't feel like it's about rights. It's about things that we can do for you, but it's not about understanding that we're rights holders, and that in this context of intersectional budgeting, there has to be a stronger focus on disability. The safe and inclusive communities, and this idea that there's going to be more funding, 141.1 million for the childcare centers. What are we going, we're going to build ramps, and then what are we going to do? Send children and parents off to the maybe accessible childcare center and hope that there are properly trained, and yes, disabled childcare workers there to welcome them and teach them and their colleagues about inclusion and ableism. You know, like I said, this is a very short view and way to approach the budget. I have something to speak about on the menstrual equity fund that I want to add here, which is intersectional feminism calls for better. Yes, it's a wonderful thing, this equity fund, but sorry, women and girls with disabilities need this, but they also need other personal care items. This is an ableist and ageist initiative, and over again, Dawn Canada has to be the one to bring these things up. I don't know how much time I have left, so I'm just going to close now with, we are deeply concerned about the language and approach to the NAP in this budget, and Lise and others have spoken on this. So I'll close with an official reprimand to the Government of Canada. So many initiatives and some things in this budget that remind us of that, with the housing as just one example. But accessible and affordable housing is not available, and the deadly consequences are evident to Dawn Canada already. Over a year ago at a feminist budget event, I spoke about a woman to many of us known as Ruth. Ruth lived with environmental sensitivities. Ruth was an advocate, but Ruth lost hope. Early in 2022, as we feared, Ruth took MAID because she gave up hope. So behind this budget, Closed Doors, NDP, Liberal Coalition, hold promise, but we expect you to deliver. The largest and most underserved women in this country cannot continue to be footnoted in budget. Thank you.
Fantastic. Couldn't have thought of a better way to end. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anne Decter from the Canadian Women's Foundation for some final words.
Thanks, Deanna. I just want to thank everyone for the fabulous presentations. It's so wonderful to get everybody's voices in the same place. And it certainly packs a powerful message or series of messages. Thanks, Deanna, for coming up with this fabulous idea, and to everybody who's working on the back end to make it happen. We've recorded the event and we'll be posting it on YouTube. We'll circulate a link to that to everybody who's attended, along with the list of presenters, in case there is media or anyone else who wants to follow up. And thank you very much for joining us this morning.